Hello, I'm Bill Kubota. I'm a producer at Detroit Public TV, but I don't know if we can show our folks that are on the other line here. We'll get you on the big screen. Hold on. There we go. There's Mika Kennedy and Celeste Goedert. They were the ones that put the Exiled to Motown exhibition together. That was at the Detroit Historical Museum not too long ago, but maybe it was long enough that we're trying to get our memories back to remember what went up there. But maybe we start by going back to the slideshow and talking about that exhibition, and then we can talk to the curators about that. I guess you can start, Mika, talk about what we got up here.
Sure, that'd be my pleasure. Thank you so much, Bill, and everyone who put together this event. Celeste and I are super excited to be here in conversation with you and to share a little bit about Exiled to Motown, a community history of Japanese Americans in Detroit, which is an exhibit that belongs to the Japanese American Citizens League Detroit chapter, of which we are both members. There we go. I was gonna say, I've been told there was a slideshow and now it has disappeared, but it's back. And so, as I said, Exiled to Motown is a community history based on a collection of oral histories that was collected by the chapter over the course of over a decade in the early 21st century, early 2000s. Really thinking through what it means to have a Japanese American community in a place like Metro Detroit that is often not considered part of Japanese American history and part of even Asian American life in this area. And so what this slideshow really looks at, I guess it's going very quickly, what it really looks at is that history as told through the story of one particular individual whose name is Mary Kamidoi, who came here with her family as a young girl after World War II and after being incarcerated in Arkansas as a Japanese American during World War II. And her family came up to Michigan to make a new life, having been forcibly removed from their home in Stockton, California. And so what this slideshow is going to look at is kind of a cross-section of that broader history as told through her experiences. Celeste, did you want to talk a little bit about the question around numbers?
Sure, thank you. Well, so as you can see on the slide, we often hear when we talk about Japanese American incarceration, if you actually heard about it at all in school, I know I heard very little. We hear this number often of like over 120,000 people. And I think, what we were trying to highlight in this exhibit, as seen on this slide, is that, these were actual people, way more than just numbers. And we know from various instances throughout history that when people are reduced to numbers, and in this case, it's a reference to, families being assigned a certain number, it's a telltale sign, like a red flag of how white supremacy is dehumanizing people. And so I think one of the iconic images that comes up throughout the exhibit is I don't know if it was on one of the earlier slides, but it was the tag that Mary Kamidoi's family received. And, we have, and some of you may have even heard her, you've had the pleasure of meeting Mary herself. She'll say, we were no longer the Kamidois, we were family number, I don't remember the exact number. There it is. Yeah, number 6928. And so that really tells you something about just the way that this changes and shapes identity, the process of dehumanization, the fact that this is like a living memory for Japanese Americans, many of whom I feel like I've been lucky to meet and be in community with. It's very telling just for the broader machinations of white supremacy. So I think a lot about, not just assigning people to numbers of the tag, but also the purpose of this exhibit being to go beyond just, okay, we had these like tens and thousands of people being incarcerated, but how do we kind of undo that process of making people into numbers through this work? So I think we can maybe move forward.
And I think where this becomes a particularly Detroit or Michigan story is in that sense that when we talk about Japanese American incarceration, we're often talking about the incarceration itself, the years 1941 or 1941 to 1945, and not about the afterwards. And I think that attends these sorts of assumptions that after 1945, the kamidois became the kamidois once more, and everything was smooth sailing from there. Of course, that's not necessarily how history bears out. And once a war is over, what is now presented is how to refashion a new life in a new place that is indelibly connected to this history of war, this history of incarceration, but it's now also very much connected to the new place where that life is beginning, here, Metro Detroit. And where that becomes, I think, particularly useful to think with historically is thinking about what we know about Detroit. Oftentimes, Japanese Americans are not front-billed in that story, and the sense of the incredible racial dichotomies that shape and continue to shape life in Detroit oftentimes becomes that center story, where we're thinking about like 8 Mile, we're thinking about the division between a Black Detroit and white suburbs oftentimes. And it's useful to begin thinking about how Japanese Americans fit into that story when we think about migrations into the region, migrations into the city of Detroit, coming both from the South as part of the Great Migration or the Second Great Migration during the 1940s, Black families coming to the North looking for jobs in the industrializing cities, as well as migrations of Japanese Americans in much smaller numbers from these incarceration camps to the Midwest, to the East Coast, looking for similar things as they are leaving the camps during and after World War II. Should I continue, or do you want to talk a little bit, Celeste?
Sure. So, I mean, I think you kind of primed this very well. But something that I think we'll revisit again later when we're more so in conversation is just how intentional and how designed this all was. And so, you know, even at a point where Japanese Americans were maybe legally allowed to return to the West Coast, there was a very intentional push for folks to resettle in the Midwest. You know, there was an encouragement that that's how you would avoid violence and find like this hope of a new life. And so I think when we had that previous slide up talking about the Great Migration, and this is something that we might get into a little bit more later as well, but just thinking about these movements of people, you know, and Black Americans coming up from the South at the same time as Japanese Americans are coming over from the West Coast being resettled, it just has me thinking so much about just truly how manufactured white supremacy is, and how I think so much of the time what this exhibit has taught me is that the confusions I grew up with as a child, like we just didn't end up this way. There were forces at play that were pushing people into certain situations. And so often in this section of the exhibit, and I don't know how much we're gonna be able to cover today, we do start talking about the construction of the model minority myth, particularly with Japanese Americans in mind. So I think when we get to this section of the exhibit, what I always think about is just how intentional and designed this was, and how we can go back in history and like truly map out the way people were moving matched with the way they were encouraged to behave. But those are my thoughts on that, but I don't want to derail us too much. And we can get back to Mary's story, which I think is a good anchor for this abridged version. Yeah, I don't know, Mika, do you want to continue with this?
Sure. So like I mentioned at the beginning, these slides really give you a cross-section of this exhibit in telling Mary Kamidoi's story. She was incarcerated as a young girl at Rower in Arkansas. And then after World War II, her family came up by way of Missouri to Michigan, looking for opportunities to farm, to start a new life here in the Midwest, away from the kind of racist fervor that fomented the incarceration and the forced removal from California to begin with, only to find, of course, that the state of Michigan also has a very complex sense of kind of its racialized histories. So if we can continue forward in our slides, we'll be able to see a little bit about that. And here is part of the exhibit that's talking about Mary's story and talking about coming up from Arkansas, looking for those agricultural opportunities and finding them in AAPI, which is probably not what we would consider Metro Detroit anymore, but quite north, up towards the Thumb. And that's where her family had their farm. And this is, I think, really interesting to think about because it begins getting at us at the beginning of this sense of what is this place? What does it mean to be creating a Japanese American family life in this place? And oftentimes what that means is to be at the intersections with other communities of color. In this case, they're farm workers from Mexico who were working on the Kamidoy farm as she was growing up. And Mary thinking as a young girl about these kinds of new experiences that she was having, the kinds of people that she was meeting in this new place that was very much kind of had its own racialized histories. And this would continue into her young adulthood when she would later move down into Metro Detroit proper to pursue her own work. And so she ends up working for the Ford Motor Company. You may have heard of Ford Motor Company. And she says that she was one of the first Japanese women working at Ford in the 1950s. So really, in the scheme of things, quite soon after the end of World War II, and working in this environment where the memory of that war was very much a part of what people were still kind of thinking about, living through, and also in an environment where, as the years went on and the Japanese automotive industry would begin gaining steam, those sorts of kind of economic and national animosities or tensions would continue to really structure life in the Motor City. Celeste, do you want to talk a little bit about kind of life beyond the workplace?
Sure. So this section, this part of the story really goes back to what Mika was saying just a moment ago with Mary as a young woman starting to experience, I would just say, the landscape of living in Detroit. And so she talks about how she initially wanted to live in Dearborn because it would have been closer to work, but clearly anti-Japanese sentiment was still extremely strong at this time. So, they actually wouldn't sell homes to Japanese Americans at that time. So she actually ended up finding herself in the heart of what we now know as like Hitsville, USA, the heart of Motown. And now when she recounts this part, she was, she's looking back, realizing that at the time she was actually surrounded by Motown legends. And she only realized that later, but, as a young girl growing up with her roommates, she was just completely clueless to the environment, like not realizing that she was actually part of a major cultural moment, which, it's kind of funny. And at the same time, I think it opens up a bunch more questions just for what was the lived experience to be Japanese American at that time, coming from across the country versus being a Black Detroiter, being in the heart and making the culture of this time. And so we like to include this quote because, Mary clearly has a self-awareness looking back of how unconcerned could we have been that we didn't realize we were living amongst actual like musical legends. So we just like to include that.
And one of the impetuses, I think, for this exhibit is to tell the story of Japanese American community in Detroit, to tell the story of those connections to that national story, or even something that might be considered a West Coast story. But to begin weaving together that history with Detroit and to try and bring out those types of kind of cross-community conversations, those types of cross-community histories, and those forms of solidarity and solidarity building. And so when the exhibit poses this question, what does solidarity look like to you? It's in the final moments of the exhibit, as you've gone through a much longer version of this history than we can present here. But what you see in the image on the screen right now is specifically kind of thinking about where the incarceration history of Japanese Americans begins to grow roots in the histories of others. And for Detroit, for the Metro Detroit area and Dearborn in particular, one of the major through lines is thinking about anti-Muslim and anti-Arab rhetoric and actions following 9/11. And what is the word I'm looking for? The suggestion that there might be camps where Arab and Muslim Americans are placed after 9/11 who are suspected of kind of terrorism or threats to national security. The questions around creating a national registry of potentially suspect individuals and the kinds of through lines that traces back to the treatment of Japanese Americans during World War II. And so what you can see on the screen is the then Secretary of Transportation, Norman Mineta, who's Japanese American and was incarcerated during World War II, thinking or being kind of a major force in Washington to not perpetuate the same types of responses from World War II after 9/11. We also have the then president of the JCL Detroit chapter echoing those ideas and saying that like any actions that are going to unjustly diminish the freedom, rights, and dignity of the Arab Americans would certainly do the same to other Americans. And thinking about the kind of, particularly for the Metro Detroit area, the huge Arab American community in this space, and being able to make that connection at this national scale, but also to the particular scale of Metro Detroit and all of the communities that make this place what it is. Celeste, do you want to talk about Michigan as a border state?
Sure. Well, I think so. It might make sense to first introduce Sudo for Solidarity, because that's really the organization that we probably highlighted the most, or that we do highlight the most in Exiled to Motown, kind of the place where when you walked through the physical iteration of the exhibit in the gallery, this was the place where we had people land. And so to give just a very brief overview, Mika and I are also both part of this organization called Sudo for Solidarity, which was founded, I think, in 2019. It's actually a national nonviolent direct action organizing project of Japanese Americans of many different generations. I will say of all of the organizing I've done, Sudo for Solidarity has the strongest and truly just most beautiful space and just like the healthiest intergenerational relationships that I've been a part of. Like if there's any space that can provide hope for me so far, it's been the relationships I've founded with this one, because we have people all the way from like Mika and I who are later like Yonsei, Gosei generations, which means 4th generation, 5th generation Japanese Americans, to people who were Nisei, who actually grew up in camp. And so going on a tangent, but Sudo for Solidarity, we wanted to highlight them because they really started coming out doing direct action protests at ICE detention centers. The connection being, obvious that we are both had been, this is an incarcerated community. We have that in our history, but there's actually a physically like a geographic connection, and that a lot of these sites, unfortunately, it's the same land that Japanese Americans were incarcerated on. Like they're still using these same lands today to incarcerate people who are coming across the border. So we wanted to really highlight the fact, and as we were talking before about the model minority myth, that time and again we're seeing like there's this choice. Japanese Americans have the choice. Do we go with what white supremacy and the US government is pushing us to do to assimilate? Or do we go the route of solidarity? And in looking at our own history, do we connect with the people who are going through this same very similar struggles today? And so we felt like it was a natural progression. If this exhibit is ending in a question, the question is, will you join this movement as well? So we invited people at the end of the exhibit. We had a bunch of origami paper to fold a crane. And that's, I'm sorry if I just blew past this, but tsuru means crane in Japanese. And so the crane really became a vehicle for this entire conversation, for these atrocities that are still continuing to this very day, this very moment. The Biden administration is still very invested in detaining immigrant children, families, individuals, despite their rebranding otherwise. So we really wanted to include that because we see the current moment being very connected to this history, which I don't know how this experience has made you, Mika, feel, or others who worked on the exhibit, but curating family heirlooms for Exiled to Motown really showed me just how recent this all was. So I think that that's something that we just wanted to include because it's the same shit. It's still happening today, as many of our elders have said. So that's kind of the direction we went in. And I don't know, is that the end of our slide? Okay.
I think we're out of slides and you're on the big screen here now. So, well, curators, let's go back to the beginning again and talk about the exhibition called Exiled to Motown. How did this come about in the first place? How did you guys get involved? Or you people? I'm old. Bear with me.
I can start us off with that. So I do want to say that Exiled to Motown is kind of an umbrella term for a lot of different related projects by the JCL Detroit chapter, in the sense that it originated as this collection of oral histories that was collected from the early 2000s into 2014 in a self-published book. And then where Celeste and I come in is beginning to think through with the chapter, how are we going to get these stories out? How are we going to share them? How do we continue building these connections that we're so interested in connecting? And that's where Exiled to Motown then became first a traveling exhibit that was quite small. It actually debuted here at the Ann Arbor District Library before going to the Novi Public Library and the JCL National Convention in Salt Lake City, as well as the Consul General's office in Detroit, and the University of Michigan, and then became a much larger exhibit and kind of three-dimensional exhibit, thinking about how we can bring in community objects to help continue to tell these ongoing stories at the Detroit Historical Museum. It was originally slated for the summer of 2020, which for some reason that you may be familiar with did not happen, and then came to fruition in 2021. And currently the exhibit is within the purview of Celeste and I as co-curators as we think about how to continue traveling this exhibit, how to continue sharing it with additional communities. So we're really grateful to Island and the District Library for being able to give us this opportunity.
What did you learn? I'm sure you taught a lot of people a lot of things, but were there any revelations you two had about putting this on and meeting some of the people that took a look at it?
Yeah, I can answer this one first, although I am curious to hear how Mika would answer it. This entire project was really an education for me, and I feel very grateful to have, worked with Mika, but also just learned so much from her. Having myself, I wasn't really exposed to Asian American studies properly throughout my education. It was always stories from families and friends, and that kind of continued, but in a more intense scale for this exhibit. So I would say everything here felt really new to me. I think the most shocking foundation, which I've already touched on a bit when we first started working on this exhibit, was just how intentional the resettlement of Japanese Americans was by the US government. I remember we were presenting on this exhibit for one of your classes you were teaching at the time, Mika. I don't remember which one, but you showed this video. Do you remember? Can you share the name? Because I think people should look it up if you know which video I'm referring to. It's like the US government, it's like a formal piece of propaganda. But anyway, she shows this video, which I'll let her speak to in a bit, that just shows that this was all part of a plan. And knowing the history has really put fact to the feelings of confusion that I grew up with. And I think that that's been also just a really rewarding part of working on this exhibit and meeting other Nikkei and Japanese Americans and Asian Americans generally through it, is that there's these things that, you know, you grow up knowing or hearing, like, oh, your aunt went to camp. That just didn't make sense. Things were not adding up. And then learning the history that, no, there was a very intentional effort by the US government. The government wanted Japanese Americans to assimilate. The government encouraged Japanese Americans to not talk to each other. So, you know, looking through this exhibit, seeing photos of old JCL archive photos of people at dances enjoying each other's company or dating or just socializing and being friends, to know that that was actually something that the government had told them they should not do, it really gave me like a new fire for building community.
I think the two things that I learned that really stand out to me is, first, what my place in this story is. So Celeste has family who is part of the Japanese American history of Detroit going back 100 years. I am not in that way. I came to Michigan in 2013, so I'm a fresh transplant to this community. And when I got here, I was really interested in figuring out what the Japanese American community in Michigan looked like, coming from California, coming as a graduate student who was researching the incarceration narratives of Japanese Americans, as someone whose grandparents actually were not incarcerated because they were living in the Kingdom of Hawaii. And so with that context, one of the things that was important to me as a doctoral researcher was to think not only about the kinds of histories and work that I was doing academically, the kinds of histories that I was looking at primarily cited in the West, but also what it meant to be doing that work in Michigan and to be becoming a part of a Japanese American community that was here. And so that story for me was fairly new. And the part that really stands out is thinking about how intimate those connections can immediately become, in the sense that my hometown, where I'm currently Zooming to you from in my father's house, is Fremont, California, which is where Celeste's great-grand aunt was forcibly removed from when she was incarcerated during World War II. And so if my family had been here at the same time, they also would have been in that camp. And kind of related is the other half of what I have learned is that these types of exhibits are about the dissemination of information and about being able to share stories, but also about the types of stories that come back to you, the types of stories that it inspires people to share. And what was really powerful to me in putting together this exhibit is the community members who would share with us their additional stories, or the people who would find family members who are in these photographs, and in learning about the types of histories that we have access to in our collections, were able to share their own histories back and to continue those stories, to continue adding to this narrative in a way that I feel like is very emblematic of what a community history is and what it's really striving to be. And so those are the two things that stand out to me, is what that connection looks like for me as a person, and also how this exhibit becomes part of the stories of those who are also coming to view it.
You know, what's interesting, if you look at the diaspora of those folks that came out of the camps, a lot came to the Midwest, Detroit, places like St. Louis and Chicago, a lot to Chicago, Cleveland. But what's interesting, Celeste, is your family is, at least some of that, goes before that. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So Mika mentioned this, but my great grandfather actually came to Detroit in the early 1900s. So he was here and kind of setting up a life before the war. But the story that gets highlighted a lot in the exhibit that really helps change the imagination of when people think, oh, when did Japanese Americans appear in Detroit? Is the story that apparently he first, when my great grandfather Tadai Shimoura came over from Tokushima Prefecture in Japan, he came to Reading, Pennsylvania, and was working in a factory there, but always had this very strong interest in working in automotive. And so his boss at the time said, if you really are serious about this, there's this man named Ford. Again, this is the way people were talking about Ford at the time. Some man named Ford is doing big things in Detroit. You should go there. And then apparently my grandfather was like, okay. And then his boss was like, actually, I have this piece of mail for Mr. Ford that needs to get mailed. When you get to Detroit, will you put this in like the local mail for me? And my great grandfather was like, okay. And then I always thought this was made up, but the story goes that he like memorized the address. When he gets to Detroit, he goes to Henry Ford's house and knocks on the door, and his wife answers, and my great grandfather lies and says that he is a chemist, which he wasn't, but in order to get a job. And somehow this ended up working out for him, and that launched his career working for Ford. And so this all happened before the war, which is just, it's a wild story. That this was a tall tale I always heard growing up that ended up coming back full circle when we did this exhibit, because I found out that it was true, apparently. And so, you know, when Japanese Americans were starting to be resettled to the Midwest after the war, my great grandparents had already been here and set up a life. And I think they did what they could to help provide the sense of community for people coming over from a completely different environment. Yeah, and another fact that we always like to share that I don't assume it's common knowledge by now, but maybe you've already heard, is that my great grandfather's good friend James Hirata is actually the only Asian face that you'll see in Diego Rivera's Detroit industry murals at the Detroit Institute of Arts. So if you go into that room facing the staircase, I used to work there, so I'm like, just go straight into the Rivera court. And you look on the left, there is like a single Asian worker in the murals, and that was a real person who predated the incarceration. So, short story long, Bill. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, I was going to mention that, but you did that. Mika, you're part of I think you're the head of the JACL chapter here in the Japanese American Citizens League chapter in Michigan and Detroit. There's a deep history to the JACL going back to before the war, created on the West Coast, but after the war, there's quite a sizable chapter here in Detroit. Talk a little bit about what that was. They even had a national convention of the JACL here in Detroit at one point. But it grew, and it's kind of smaller now, but I think it's picking up again.
Yeah, so the Japanese American Citizens League is a national organization that has a bunch of chapters located in different geographic regions. The bulk of them are in the West Coast, where the bulk of Japanese Americans are, but there is a strong contingent of West Coast chapters, and indeed one here in the Metro Detroit area that kind of comprises all of Michigan. And I was, up until quite recently, the most recent president of the Detroit chapter. I have since passed that mantle on to Ann O'Neill, whose mother is featured in Exiled to Motown. But I think what Bill was getting at is really important. The Japanese American Citizens League was established in 1929 as senses of anti-Asian exclusion and a little bit of yellow peril began to shape the Japanese American experience in the United States, in particular in the West Coast. And the Detroit chapter was started in 1946, immediately following World War II. And as a result of all of the families who were coming out of camp and resettling in the Midwest, away from the past, away from negative racialized experiences on the West Coast, and at the behest of the US government that was also similarly quite interested in getting Japanese Americans to be in the Midwest amongst the kind of hardy Midwestern white stock, so that they too, as Japanese Americans, could begin to lose that designator and to lose that sense of kind of an Asiatic community and just become Midwesterners. And so where that begins to get a little bit more complicated is saying like, okay, they were coming to the Midwest in order to become Midwestern, but here we are also having this Japanese American Citizens League Detroit chapter cropping up in 1946, which seems a little bit counter to the desires of that federal national narrative. And one of the reasons for that is something Celeste touched on, in that as much as assimilation was part of this post-war federal push, the types of community services and support systems that would enable people to make lives in a new place were not necessarily present. And Japanese American community needed to provide those for each other, whether that be people like Celeste's great-grandfather, who were already established in the city, or whether that be Japanese Americans who had come just a year before or a few months before, in order to really provide that sense of community and that type of housing and social and job support that is so pertinent and required of success in a new place. And that's really where the JCL Detroit chapter kind of began, and where in some respects it continues, in as much as it continues to be this place where one might find that community, where those roots continue to kind of draw people together. But I think there's also this question, or maybe this assumption, of kind of a declension narrative where the Japanese American population of Detroit now is quite different than it was, in that it's primarily Shinnikke, which is kind of generations of Japanese people who are coming to the United States after World War II and finding kind of their own types of community networks that maybe exist a little bit separately, for often for worse, from other Japanese Americans communities that come out of this post-war moment. And the declensionist narrative is like, oh, there's not really a Japanese American community in Detroit anymore. People have moved back to the West Coast. People are marrying out of this community. People are losing touch with each other. And these numbers get smaller and smaller and smaller every year. But like we said at the beginning of this talk, people are more than numbers. And you can have a community, even if that number is small, if you're continuing those relationships, if you're continuing to share that history. And that, to me, is what JCL Detroit is doing right now. It's a small group of Japanese Americans in an area that will forever be a Japanese American community and a site of Japanese American history. And that small group of people continues to have relationship with one another and continues to be here in ways that oftentimes, when we're thinking about history being only the major moments, only the biggest populations, doesn't always bear out. And when we're thinking about communities of color in particular, or other minoritized communities in a space, that's how they become marginalized. That's how they become part of the minority. And so to say, hey, it's a small community, but it's here and it matters, is what JCL Detroit is all about right now, and what part of this history is really attempting to show people, and thinking about it not as this marginalized history, but as something that does have these deep connections to so many different communities and to so many different strains of history in the Metro Detroit area.
We want to do some questions, but one more for you guys from me, and that is talk a little bit more about Mary Commodore working at Ford. 1982, Chinese-American guy, Vincent Chin, gets killed. And Mary was one of the folks that was really active in trying to find justice for Vincent Chin. And maybe talk a little bit about how I think the Japanese American community had connected with a lot of Asian Americans around town, which there weren't that many back then. Go ahead, Mika.
Okay, I can start us off. So what Bill is mentioning is the killing of Vincent Chin in 1982 by two white people in Detroit who were associated with the automotive industry. And Vincent Chin was pursued after a kind of rowdy night at a nightclub and beaten to death in the streets. He was Chinese American, but one of the reasons that this case becomes a really flashpoint moment for Asian American organizing, pan-ethnic organizing in the Metro Detroit area is because a bystander had attested to hearing his assailants say, "It's because of you we're out of work." And this was in the 1980s. This was during the oil crisis. This was a dark time for a city that had built itself so much around an automotive industry that people now could no longer afford to purchase cars from, could not afford to purchase gas to put in those cars. And one of the kind of enemies that arose in the kind of cultural perception of this moment is the Japanese automotive industry, because it was creating foreign cars for one, but also cars that at that time were a lot more desirable because they were much smaller and much more fuel efficient. And they became a scapegoat for the American automotive industry, and Vincent Chin became a human scapegoat for these broader kind of xenophobic economic tensions. And that slippage between someone who is Chinese American and Japanese automotive industry became kind of a galvanizing point for Asian Americans, understanding that people who seek to do harm to you are not going to be caught up on the details, not on the details of who you are or what the situation is. And for the Japanese American community, joining this movement that kind of is led by, at the time, a new organization called American Citizens for Justice, it was a point of recognizing that Vincent Chin was a victim of anti-Japanese sentiment, even though he was not Japanese, and wanting to be part of a movement that would be pan-Asian and that would try to fight back against generalized anti-Asian violence with a pan-Asian front of solidarity.
Well, any questions out here in the, over here? We've got a microphone.
Yes, I do ask, if you have a question, speak into the mic, please.
Yeah, and sorry, is there a way, so we can't actually see anyone. We can only see the slides right now, but we would love to see people if you're
Okay.
there.
We'll see if they can see us here. Oh, it's not possible,
You're
but
just going to have to listen. I was working at Ford in 1982, and one of the nice things about that was that at that time there was a big influence of Japanese people, and the first really good Japanese grocery store showed up in northern Detroit. I had grown up in Hawaii, so this was important to me to have access to those foods. What was the impact of that dynamic, of this influx of Japanese people into the Japanese American? I don't know. Did they stay after? Because there was a lot of schools so that their kids wouldn't be behind when they went back to Japan. What was the impact of what was a significant Japanese influx of people in the early 80s, and a visible, very visible presence of families on the, sort of original Japanese community in Detroit?
I can answer that question, unless Celeste, you want to talk a little bit about any of that.
So I would say I'm unfamiliar with the exact numbers of the influx that you're speaking to in the 1980s, but I think that that's like another interesting point that's come up so many times during this exhibit. And when we talk about wanting to have the next iteration, is how are we weaving in Shinnikke stories? Because these folks technically, even though it would have been more recent than now, would be considered Shinnikke, having come after the war and during such an interesting period of deindustrialization in Detroit. So I would say that's something that I'm hoping we explore more. But Mika, if you can actually speak fact to this, I welcome you.
I think what's interesting about that question is thinking about all of the multiple strains that do end up comprising a Japanese American community, that are inextricably connected from one another, but oftentimes in practice can feel as though they are separate communities. And I think for a lot of Japanese people who were moving to the Metro Detroit area at that time from Japan to work for the automotive industry, oftentimes they felt that that history was quite separate, and that the types of concerns or lived experiences within their own families and their own connections were kind of unfathomably different from those that were coming out of this incarceration experience. And I think oftentimes that sense of not having that same history makes it, or made it, difficult for people to come together and to understand themselves as part of a single whole. And I think this continues to be true in the present day. And so if we're thinking about what the impact was of these multiple communities, we can definitely point to there being kind of a resurgence of Japanese businesses to kind of cater to this new community, whether it be language schools or whether it be the business associations, whether it be grocery stores, but also the sense of separateness, and the sense of separateness that isn't a hard line, but does continue to this day in thinking through all of these different populations that now make up the Metro Detroit area. And I think for the Vincent Chin case for American Citizens for Justice, that was not necessarily the connecting point that could bring these two forms of Japanese American community together in that moment. And so that continues to be a horizon, I think, that we're still striving for.
Anyone else? I think it's interesting if you look, I think, post the Vincent Chin killing, which is 82, by the mid to late 80s, you saw Japanese car companies build plants in the U.S. Ohio had the Honda plant, then later on Nissan and Toyota, and then a lot of supplier companies and other R&D operations came in the Detroit area with Japanese car companies, and then you saw more Japanese people coming to work here, and that was a whole different, like you were saying, a different strain of folks. Some not intending to stay, some wanting to stay when they realize how big the houses are. But that kind of makes things more interesting too, because I think within the JACL we had one of the past presidents was from Japan and had worked for Ford, right? Talk a little about Toshiki and his involvement and why he cared about being part of the JACL, if you know.
Toshiki is a good friend of mine. I'm sure he would be mortified if we talked about his life history. He's like, oh, we don't need to talk about me. He's a very humble person, but he came to the United States as a kind of college-age teenager for his education here, ended up working for Ford, continues to live here in the Metro Detroit area. But he's an interesting kind of contemporary 21st century figure in the Japanese American Citizens League Detroit chapter, because he is someone who is Shinnikke and came from Japan, but was one of the people who was looking to bridge those types of gaps. He was very active in the Asian American community in Michigan at large. He is a member of MAPAC, which is an acronym that I am going to butcher if I attempt, but it's the Midwest. Okay, I'm not going to try. MAPAC.
It's MAPAC, MAAPAC, and I can't remember what.
I think it's
somebody
Michigan
knows.
Asian Pacific American
We're going to
Association.
have
Hi,
Francis
this
tell
is
us.
Francis. It's Michigan Asian Pacific American Advisory Commission, and it's the Governor's Advisory Commission.
Thank you so much, Francis. It's always good to have a journalist on deck to keep our facts straight. So Toshiki is one of those individuals in the very immediate history of Japanese American community who's really invested in kind of bridging those gaps and being Shinnikke, but being so deeply ingrained in the Japanese American history and kind of political consciousness of Michigan. And as president of the Japanese American Citizens League, worked really hard to develop relationships between MAPAC and the JCL Detroit chapter, and between the Consulate General of Japan in Detroit and the JCL Detroit chapter. And I think that's the kind of energy that I find really exciting in making these connections happen, and that I think is incredibly important when oftentimes there are people who are Shinnikke but have also grown up in Michigan and feel as though they somehow don't have a right to be part of that community because that history is not there. And I empathize with that as someone who, again, had family in the Kingdom of Hawaii who were not incarcerated and has come here to Michigan from California. And for Toshiki to have been the president of this organization, I think speaks to that sense of welcome and that sense that this community and its definitions are always moving. And the direction that I think we're trying to move in and that we are moving in is to pick up as many different people along the way as possible and to kind of braid those communities together in ways that across history has kind of happened, kind of haven't. It's this will you, won't you kind of dance, and that I hope will continue to become closer and closer as we move forward.
No. One other question though, regarding the exhibition, what's next with that? Is that going to be playing anywhere else? Are you working on some other stuff?
As a matter of fact, what we're currently working on is to redevelop some of the materials so that they are easily travelable. And we're still working with the Detroit Historical Museum, which have been really fabulous partners in being able to make that happen as part of their collection of traveling exhibits and their real investment in trying to share these stories with as many different places and types of institutions as possible that might not otherwise have the capacity or ability to host these types of installations. And so this coming fall, we're currently working on an exhibition with Wayne State University to share portions of the Exiled to Motown story, and that will be our pilot project for this new travel-friendly version of the exhibit that can be easily set up in different places and kind of made modular in ways so that they can fit all different types of spaces. Like, for instance, when I was designing Exiled to Motown, it was designed very much for the community gallery in the Detroit Historical Museum. And now we're really looking at ways that we can play with that story and make these narratives as flexible to the different spaces it might appear in as possible, and also think of ways to be able to connect that history to the locality of wherever it might be, and to think about how we can continue building that story. For instance, if it travels to Wayne State. What is the history of Japanese Americans in Wayne State and their, for instance, their Japanese room? If it travels somewhere as far flung as Colorado, what connections can we make between the Metro Detroit Japanese American community and, say, the Denver Japanese American communities, which shares a similar but distinctly Denver flavor to that history? And so we're looking at ways of being able to travel the exhibit and continue to enrich and embolden those stories by really looking at those connections and the forms of solidarity that can come out of them.
Yeah, so if anyone out there, I know we can't see you, but if you have any ideas, don't hesitate to reach out to us, because this is really a community effort and a community exhibit. So like Mika said, we're hoping to connect with as many people along the way as possible and hear everyone's ideas.
Well, one of the centerpieces, or actually the centerpiece, is a kiss on a tree, which I think you can see downstairs right now. And that's connected to an event that's happening on the 20th of this month at 6:30 a Saturday. I don't know if you know all about that, but it's a kiss in a tree performance with some storytelling and some movement. If you all want to come out and see that, that's right here. Oh, Francis has something to say.
That's such a great question, Bill Kubota. I have a question for Celeste. Could you tell us more about the Kizuna tree, how you designed it, what you were creating with it? It's such a beautiful sculpture. I'd love to hear the background story about that.
Oh, sure. Thank you, Francis. Yeah, so, well, first I'll say I'm really excited with how it's evolved. The first idea that we had for Kizuna Tree was actually when we knew we wanted to highlight Tsudu for solidarity in the exhibit. We wanted to have a way to display the strands of the cranes, because it really is like the iconic centerpiece of the movement. When we see that, we're really trying to build this association. Another thing that I wanted to do and incorporate in this exhibit, because the reason I joined in was because I knew I had family history. My great aunt Toshiko Shimoura is actually one of the, she was one of the people alongside Mari Kamidoi who they were actually best friends when my great aunt was alive. The two of them were the ones who worked very, very hard on the Book of Oral Histories, and really wanted to make sure that it was published before a lot of the people who were interviewed passed away. So I wanted to honor her in this exhibit. And she was actually very involved in the Ikebana, Ikenoba International Detroit chapter. And if you don't know, Ikebana is one of the three dos of traditional Japanese art. So there's like Kado, Chado, Shodo, Shodo being calligraphy, Chado being the tea ceremony, and Kado is flower arranging, also known as Ikebana. And so I always had this association with her. And I was trying to think of how can we bring her memory and presence into the exhibit and also display the cranes. And so kind of had this vision of creating like a giant ikebana, because mostly when I would think of ikebana, they would be small scale flowers and maybe a lacquer box or ceramic with the little frog in it and the flowers coming out. But for this, we're really hoping to dream big. And so it was really rooted in emulating ikebana, being inspired by it. And at the same time, I acknowledge being a very Japanese American take, in which, I don't practice ikebana. I was embarrassed to show people who actually did, like, this is supposed to kind of be like ikebana, but I think that kind of speaks to the Japanese American experience of wanting to honor heritage, but also taking a different spin on it. What I really appreciate about Chen and Bill and Francis and Rising Voices is that we're giving this the sculpture a new life and an iteration as it now being known as Kizuna Tree. And I like that it's becoming a tree, growing from being a little flower arrangement to being a tree, because the tsudu, the cranes, need a place to land. So I appreciate how others have really, I had this idea, but it was really my father and my partner, Davis Nakashima, who helped build it. And then now it's become really something that is in the spirit of community art. Chen is bringing it to this whole new level by incorporating it with Island. So yeah, we're really excited that the tree has stayed alive, and the branches I'll add are foraged from a local Michigan nature center. So it's all Michigan.
And I think it's a really great example of building stories by telling stories. So I folded several thousand cranes for this tree and also enlisted basically everyone I knew to fold cranes. And they're like, oh, teach me how to fold a crane. Oh, this is so cool. Oh, we'll continue to do this. And then I invited every single one and took them to the exhibit at the end of the day too. And they were excited to learn the history and excited to realize that they were already a part of the exhibit, even though they didn't initially have the sense that they were a part of a community history, or that they could be because they're not Japanese American. But they became a part of the exhibit by folding the crane, by learning what all of this history was, and thinking about how it connects to their lives in Michigan, in Indiana, in Illinois, and places even far afield from the Midwest.
Well then, where are we on this time-wise?
Looks like we're about ready to wrap up. Before we wrap up, I did want to mention two things. First, Exiled to Motown will be on display on our lobby screen through our rotating exhibit throughout the month of May. So I invite you to go look at that. And we will also have an event May 15th. We'll be hosting a conversation with Mary Kamadao to speak more about her life and her experience working with this exhibit. But with that, thank you all so much for coming, and thank you to our presenters for bringing this exhibit together and talking with us.
Let me just say one more thing about Mary, though. It's important. There are very few people that are still alive that knew what was really going on in these camps, these 10 camps that were on the west side of the country here. And if there's very few in the Detroit area, and she's one of them. So thank you.
Yes, and with that, we're done. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I will second that, Bill. Mary is not to be missed. She is one of the most outspoken, vibrant, intensely humble people I have ever met. So make sure that you hear from her.